My name is Rachel Beal, and I'm going to share my story of how I grew up in Brazil as a missionary kid and spent 18 years there and then have been in the United States since then. And there's some very interesting parallels, I think, between the two countries and how religion has affected the public arena and choices that they're making in politics and society. So I want to start by talking a little bit about my parents and our environment there, and then come back to this. So my parents were both Minnesota farm kids who went to St. Olaf College, and they met in Minneapolis when my dad was in seminary and my mom was working as a nurse. Dad has a funny story about how he asked a friend of his if he knew anybody who was desperate to get married and wanted to be a missionary. And they went on a blind date, which was they went to church together. And 6 weeks later, they were engaged. 6 months later, they were married. And a year later, they had me. I was conceived in Brooklyn, New York. And my mother actually was interested in working in Appalachia after finishing her nursing internships. But Dad wanted to go either to Africa or to Brazil, and they ended up going to Brazil. Both of them had a really great set of skills that worked really well together, and there used to be a joke that all the missionaries had to have a spouse because it was free labor for the church. In their case, it really worked. Dad was the preacher and had responsibilities there with the church and with the youth groups, and there were several preaching points that he went to that were rural areas. And my mom actually used her nursing skills a lot when we were down there. And she was very active in the women's groups and in the choir. And our house was always full of kids. And she was constantly keeping an eye on all of us and making Kool-Aid and keeping everything running. She was the practical person, and my dad was had to be anchored to the ground. The first year that they were there, they spent in Campinas, which is about 2 hours from São Paulo, and it has a language school that all the missionaries would go to learn Portuguese. And after that first year, they went to Luanda, Paraná, which is in the very interior, close to Paraguay. And at the time that they arrived in Brazil, this is 1962. I was 6 months old when they got there, and I was born in 1962, so that would have been around July or August. There was a leftist government in place, and the missionaries were all very frightened because there was a lot of resentment and antagonism towards the United States. The word was that they had plans on killing all Americans that were in country at that time. The United States intervened and helped get a coup going. And in 1964, the military took over and we started living under a military dictatorship. At the time before the coup, my parents actually had plans on escaping to Paraguay if things went south for them. That experience, I think, really colored their sympathy or lack of sympathy towards leftist organizations or movements. And they were in Luanda, Paraná, and it was a very tiny place with the streets weren't paved yet, and it was very basic services there. And my dad talks about how at that time he would go visit rural families, and all this deforestation was going on, and there would be fire on both sides of the road, eating up all these trees and making room for farmland. Mom remembers not being able to get enough produce and being very isolated out there. During that time, my brother and sister were born. My brother was born at a missionary conference in Londrina, which was about, I think, 2 or 3 hours from Luanda, but it had a good-sized hospital there. And so she gave birth to him on this time when all the other Americans were in town too. And then my sister was born when I was about 4.5 years old, and I remember her being born, and I remember that the hospital was very close to our house, and I was so excited to have a little sister. And then when I got there and saw this little red thing, I was so disappointed because she couldn't play with me. That's about the only thing I remember from that. We were with the American Lutheran Church, which is now the ELCA. And at that time, the setup was that you could spend 5 years in the country that you were in and then a year in the United States on furlough, or you could choose 3 years, 3 months, or 2 years, 2 months. So they had spent 5 years now, and the next year went to the United States. So I was 5, my brother was 3, and my sister was just a baby when we went back to the U.S. for the first time. And that was the first time that we really understood that we were Americans. And we met family, we met grandparents on both sides, and both my mother and father came from families of 6. They had 5 siblings each, and they were both the second oldest on both sides. And they were farmers, and dairy and growing corn and things like that. And that gave us such an interesting experience to see all of this firsthand. And I actually went to a little school in Minnesota where I think it was preschool or first grade, I'm not sure. But having the experience of being with other kids and meeting our cousins and all of that gave us kind of an identity. Plus, we traveled a lot too and saw different people. And we learned a lot about the Midwestern landscape in the United States. Then we went back to Brazil, to a new city called Maringá, and that's what I consider my hometown. That's what we lived there for 12 years, and those were the formative years of our lives and the best time that we all had, I think, ever. And Maringá is a city that is thriving today. It's a metropolis, but when we got there, it was still a very young town that had been pre-planned and was bringing in immigrants from all over the place. A third of our population was Japanese, and my best friend who lived across the street from me, Adélia, and her family were Japanese, and I got to learn the Brazilian Japanese culture a lot by being at their house all the time. And my sisters, both my brother and sister's best friends were of Italian descent, and the Italians in Brazil that we knew were blonde and blue-eyed, where I think the Sicilians came to the U.S. and the northern Italians went to Brazil. So we had a very different stereotype of Italians that we didn't really see until we came to the United States. And my brother's best friend's father actually was very instrumental in the development of both the city and in the agricultural arena around the city. And he was ahead of his time in terms of conservation and the type of farming that he did. And one of the really neat things about the city is that they designed 2 huge parks that look like, from an aerial view, they look like lungs, and they were meant to keep the air clean of the city. And one of them was more developed. It had a lagoon in the middle, and we had those little paddle boats that we could go on, and there was a jogging track all the way around it, and there was a Japanese garden and a zoo, a horrible zoo. Different things for kids to do that we could do there. And then the other lung was left native and has a museum and collection of archives on the city and history, and also on the plants that were there. It's a really wonderful thing. And the city itself was made to be planned as a very green city with flowering trees right from the beginning. So all of us had kind of an eclectic education there because we had an enclave of American missionaries there was the missionary church, and then there was a Baptist family and some other people, and they organized a little American school for us. And it was kind of one of those one-room things where you have everybody together, and we used different correspondence programs to go through our different years. So for first grade, my mom homeschooled me. And then 2nd through 5th grade, I was at that little American school full time. And then from 5th grade to 8th grade, we went to a Catholic school in the morning and then the American school in the afternoon. As far as religion goes, we had this Lutheran environment that church was right next door to our house, and we had these activities going on all the time from our church. And then we had the families that were at the missionary church, and they became like our extended family. Our uncles and aunts and their kids were all our peers, our American peers, and they actually built a Bible camp that was just outside of the city, and we all helped build it. I was involved with both of our youth group in our church and the youth group in their church. And it was just such an incredible experience to do that and learn about construction and, sweat. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful time. And then the Catholic church, the Catholic school was interesting too, because there were quite a few of us Protestant missionary kids there who were American, and we were kind of treated as elites. And the head nun would often, tell the other kids, why can't you be more like, the Protestant kids and behave, blah, blah, blah. But one thing that was so interesting was that Vatican II happened, and that meant that all the different nuns and priests and their schools, they could choose whether they wanted to continue to wear the habit or they could wear regular clothing. Well, it turns out our head nun had really beautiful legs, and she showed them off, and within a month she was married. It was so funny. It was a big scandal. Anyhow, there were all these different things going on as far as our understanding of God and religion and church. At that time, Brazil was about 90% Roman Catholic, but the Catholics there often mixed religions with other beliefs, including Spiritism was a really big thing that started in the 50s, I think, with Allan Kardec. There were quite a few African Umbanda, Candomblé, and other African-based religions that merged in with the Catholic Church and created a new authentic Brazilian religious language and icons and all of that. The Protestants that were there started out by being mostly from the mainstream Protestant churches, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, and all. That was in the 1960s, but in the 70s, Pentecostalism started to grow like wildfire. All of a sudden, there were all these new churches in Brazil, Assembly of God, and all kinds of things. And my dad was involved with the ecumenical movement there, and often would share stories of things that he found just unbelievable. For example, one pastor was proud that he had kicked his daughter out of the house because she cut her hair and wanted to wear blue jeans. So there were all these things that we were trying to figure out about what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to be an American, what it meant to be a human. One of the things about my dad is that he was an English lit major in college, and both he and my mom were avid readers, and he had me reading European intellectual types of authors by the time I was 12, 13. That really influenced a lot of my thinking too, because both he and they were skeptics. Dad told me once, believe 80% of what you see, 50% of what you hear, and 30% of what you read, or something like that. Basically, don't just accept everything you hear or read or see as truth. And we would have discussions about all kinds of things, but like evolution, why does the creation story have to be about 7 human days and 7 nights, or why can't those be eons? Why can't evolution be a part of creation? Why, all these questions. And he was always very supportive of that kind of exploration, and he liked sci-fi. So my understanding of Christianity and of faith came through this very open and loving and supportive, this was a very friendly place to talk about ideas and questions and all of that. And the multiculturalism was really important too, because we had such a range of experiences with people that had come from other places, and there was no I didn't feel like those years like was racism. I'm sure there was, but I was a kid and didn't know it. All I know is that my friends were from all over the world, and they spoke different languages at their houses. We were encouraged to learn whatever we wanted. These were the 70s were hippie times, and everybody sang, we felt mom fixed our pants so that we were in style, and we had bell bottoms, and we wore platform shoes and got perms, and dad had long sideburns, and the youth group, they were all Mod Squad, and we were encouraged to pursue whatever creative interests we had. My brother studied guitar, my sister studied ballet, I studied piano and hated it, but I learned embroidery and a whole bunch of other things which I really loved. My dad was an inventor. He was always tooling around with different things and involving us and using, power tools and solders and whatever. It was just a really, really wonderful place to be. I also went to a Japanese preschool. I forgot about that. So the interesting thing about these different cultures is that in the 1800s, Brazil had put a call out to immigrants to come in exchange for land. They could develop the agricultural side. And I think that was under the emperor, Dom Pedro I, who was actually the guy who gave Brazil its independence. And the Germans had been in Brazil for like 150 years when we came, and they were Lutheran in Germany and came to Brazil as Lutherans. And the whole reason why there were Lutheran missionaries were down there was because they didn't have a seminary. And so the churches from Germany and the United States sent missionaries down there while they built a facility in São Leopoldo. So the goal all along was that at some point there would be indigenous pastors who had been trained in Brazil that could minister to Brazilians, and then the foreigners would go back home. And while we were there were more and more Brazilians graduating from seminary. The seminary had been built, and then they were graduating and going out to fill the need for all these German immigrants. The Germans that were in Brazil for all these years now spoke their own Brazilianized dialect. All the different ethnic groups had places around the country where, like, it was like an Italian city, or there were just enclaves of places where, like there are here in the United States, where you didn't have to speak Portuguese. You could just get along quite fine in your mother tongue. Well, when World War II happened, that all changed, and we got a whole new wave of immigration down there, including a lot of Nazis that ended up in Brazil, and some of them ended up in our church. And there was a huge resentment between the old Germans and the newcomers. They spoke different languages, their worldviews were completely different, and the Nazi types were pretty much ostracized by the rest of the congregation. After World War II, the Brazilian government enforced nationalization of all foreign schools and language institutes and churches. Everything had to be done in Portuguese. So we were in a transition phase where these churches, the younger people were bilingual, but a lot of the old-timers only spoke in German. So Dad actually learned how to speak some German so that he could communicate with them. And then he would trade with a German pastor from another town, would come once a month to our place, and he would go to theirs and do a sermon in Portuguese. That happened for maybe 3 or 4 years, and by the time we left, everything was pretty much in Portuguese. There were these interesting things happening that were creating a Brazilian psyche that was beyond where you came from. The South, where we were industrialized and became very, very wealthy, it's almost like two different countries. The North is underdeveloped, underfunded, has a lot of poverty, where the South was where the wealth was. So that's like our North and South. And there were huge, huge plantations up in the North. And the city that we were in also had a state university, so it brought in a lot of young people that were going to school there. Education was a really big thing with everybody in our peer groups, and it's much, much harder to go to university in Brazil than it is here in the United States. You have to go through these tests, and they only have like 30 people might be competing for one spot, and if you don't get in, you've got to wait. I don't know how it is now, but that's how it was when I was growing up. Dad was a district pastor and a youth pastor and had several preaching points in rural areas. That meant that he was gone a lot on the road, and it also meant that a lot of people came through to see us, to see him. Our house was constantly a busy place of travelers coming through. And sometimes he took us with him, and one time he took me on I think I must have been around 14 or 15. We went to Mato Grosso, which is under the Amazon. Heard of the Pantanal? That's where the marshlands are, and this was very undeveloped at that time. And the memories that I have of that trip with him, I think we were gone for 2 weeks, and there had been a big flood, and a lot of the towns that we went through had watermarks up to like the window of the house, and there was bad roads and trucks overturning, and then just the nature, the bugs, the insects. We were at this one house where we were having soup outside, and you could barely reach the spoon to your mouth because there were like 50 different types of insects trying to get into your mouth. And that's all gone now. You know, our city, when we first moved there were all kinds of, one of the kids in the American school, Tim Ross, we had those desks that you open the lid, and he always had all kinds of creepy crawly things in there. And he actually grew up to be a biologist, so it's pretty funny. DDT was used everywhere, and within 10 years, the cockroaches survived and some ants, and just was a lot less. So those 18 years that we were there, Brazil went from being a wild country that you'd see in National Geographic as a crazy place, very little infrastructure, to becoming a world power. So those years under the dictatorship, what people really liked was that there was order, and they were getting loans from the World Bank. There was a lot of multinationals coming from many different countries and building things there, and the whole infrastructure changed completely in 12 years, from unpaved roads to big highways, from skyscrapers everywhere. You'd see mansions next to little shacks, and the pace of it was absolutely breathtaking. What people didn't like about it is that there wasn't much freedom. And I remember being about 12, and I was starting to learn about politics, and I still don't really understand how Brazil's government is formed, but they have a Senate like we do, and Congress, and there's a presidency. But I remember being with a group of the church people out on the sidewalk, and I was asking questions, and I said, "So is Brazil a democracy?" And they all looked at me and looked behind themselves and said, "Well, of course it is. Don't ever ask that again. Of course Brazil is a democracy. Shh, be quiet." And there was this fear, and people were disappearing. There were protests in the big cities. Many of the artists that we liked, the popular Brazilian musicians, were in exile. They went to London, they went to New York, and one of them was taken in by the military and tortured and became kind of brain dead. And a guy from our church disappeared. He was a student, and his sister was very close to our family. And nobody ever heard from him again. There was this aura of fear that we want these things, the currency in Brazil, I think, changed 3 times in the last 50 years. Inflation was such a big problem. A big thing that happened in the 70s was the rise of liberation theology in Latin America. That was mostly developed in Argentina and some of the other Spanish-speaking countries, but it made its way over to Brazil too. And what it did was to cause a split in the Catholic Church, a huge split, where the priests were either siding with the poor or defending the interests of the elite. And one of the priests became very well known worldwide, Dom Helder Câmara. He was kind of like a Mother Teresa figure in Brazil. And all throughout South America, the Catholic Church just really went down the middle. Vatican II had also allowed for Portuguese being spoken in the churches, in the Catholic churches, and guitars to be played. So this is hippie time again, and religion was becoming democratized and popularized and accessible, and Jesus was your buddy. You had an intimate relationship. When we were young, every house we went to in Brazil, it was just so common to see the Catholic houses. They had a picture of JFK on the wall, and then next to that, a picture of the bleeding heart of Jesus. Jesus has an open wound, and it shows you the bleeding heart, or a crucifix or something like that. But these were the 2 big influences of the time, was America, North America, US, and this Jesus. Liberation theology made its way into the Lutheran Seminary in São Leopoldo too. And my father, I think because of his experience with when they first got to the country, completely distrusted and didn't like this new approach to theology. Yet, he lived it. He was always advocating for the poor and for justice, and he did it in ways that were seen. One of my big memories, coming home one day, and there was this old German homeless lady that had a perpetual sore on her forehead because her father had beaten her so much that just never healed. And the beatings addled her brain, and she always wore like a scarf over that wound, and it was kind of gooey. And I walked into the kitchen, and she was sitting on a chair with her back to me, and my dad had her feet in a pan of water, and he said, "Rachel, can you run upstairs and get a pair of tennis shoes for her?" And so I ran up and got her my tennis shoes and brought them down, and her feet were just bloody and full of blisters, and he washed them and cleaned them and put antiseptics on them and wrapped them up. And seeing my tennis shoes on this woman's feet was just such a powerful image for me. To me, that is what Christianity is about. It's about the poorest of the poor being seen, the poorest of the poor being cared for, the poorest of the poor being included, being invited into your kitchen to sit down. So while he discredited the things that liberation theologians were talking about, he was in fact practicing a lot of it himself. And then I turned 15, and the discussion came around of what to do with Rachel. And they either wanted to send me back to the U.S. for high school or go to Campinas at the American school there. I didn't want to be away from them and all my friends, and I ended up in Campinas. The Lutheran church had built a hostel that was within walking distance of the American school. And when we were young, most of the American families had all their kids there. But my parents and a couple other families decided that we would be bilingual and that we would go to Brazilian schools, and just wanted us home with them. By the time I got there for high school, that's what most families were doing as well. So there were only like 3 of us in this huge building on this big campus that was just a really wonderful place that had fruit trees, and we had this wonderful couple taking care of us. And So I had my own room, and then I go to this American school, and it was my first contact with wealthy Americans. And they actually weren't that wealthy, I don't think, but they were middle-class Americans who, because they were in Brazil, had wealth. And so these other kids were like being driven around in limousines and had swimming pools in their houses, and it was just a very, very different exposure for me. And I was very naive and protected and was in this Christian bubble. And I didn't really make very close friendships there, although many of us are still in touch on Facebook. But I felt like an outsider. So I spent a lot of time in my room just doing art. And I sold the stuff that I made at an art craft every Saturday. And I had a stamp collection and different things like that. While I was gone, my dad got involved with the Catholic Charismatic movement, and that really changed things for us big time, because that intellectual guy who said question everything was now speaking in tongues and having visions. And I mean, it didn't change him fundamentally, but we no longer spoke the same language or saw Christianity in the same way, and it was really, really painful for me. And so my sister kind of took my place as daddy's girl, and she got involved too. And it was just really alienating for me to go home and have this new understanding of the Holy Spirit that take over you and do stuff. And I tried really hard to understand that and to be open to it, but I don't like anything that takes away my even God, like you can be in my heart, be in my mind, but don't like do things through me that I can't control. Or the high school years were going back and forth, and still all these friends and all of that. It ended, and the agreement had been that when I went to college, then the family would move back, and I always felt really horrible about it, because if they had stayed, the church would continue to pay for my trips down there, and I could see all my friends. But it was really traumatic leaving. There were 300 people we took a bus from Maringá to Rio and got the plane from Rio to the U.S. And, the whole church, all our friends, everybody was at the bus station crying, hugging us. It was awful. And this paradise that we knew was gone. So we come back to the U.S. and I think we had a few weeks before college, and I end up in this Norwegian school in Minnesota where everybody looks like me and has no clue about Brazil. So I hung out with the international kids. I was much more comfortable with them than I was with the white rich kids that I didn't know their world. St. Olaf was an amazing institution with the professors that I had. They were top of the line people that really made you think. They had this really cool program called College, which everybody else laughed at. They said, "Oh, what are you doing? You're going to study underwater basket weaving, huh?" And it was kind of seen as a hippie thing. It was a leftover from the 60s, and it's defunct now, but I think it's an amazing way to learn. And basically, you had to pick a theme that you were going to study, and you had to pick 3 different areas to study that theme. My theme was church and state relations in Brazil, and my 3 areas were political science, sociology, and religion. And I had a sociology professor, a religion professor, and a political science professor. And I took classes in the regular college that had to do with this, but you could also do one-on-one studies with a professor, or you could get a group of students together that were interested in something together and get a professor who would agree to guide you through that. And then you had to do a senior paper, and mine was on Black Brazil. So I was interested in racial justice even back then. I wanted to know more about racism in Brazil. The classes that I took and the things that I read really shocked me, because I didn't know what was going on in Brazil at the time that we were growing up there. And then you start reading how, the documentation of what happened. It's horrifying. I had nightmares as I learned about all the tortures and the disappearances, and that it was enabled by the United States. And the torturers were trained at the American, what's it called? Oh, I forgot now, but the American school it's a military school in Texas. And they were brought up here and taught torture tactics. And so it made me really conflicted about being an American, and what does it mean to be a patriot? What does it mean to love these two countries? I've always felt that the United States, it's kind of got a split personality. On the one hand, it has a huge amount of compassion and does amazing things for poor and for people around the world and for refugees and starving people. And the Peace Corps was an example of a really powerful American program that really did a lot, both for the United States and for the countries that the Peace Corps was in. And then on the other hand, you have this country that gobbles up resources. I mean, all over Latin America, our multinational companies were there, and our military was backing them, and they just sucked everything they could out of these countries. It's just really, really horrible to learn about our role, even here in the United States, with minorities and indigenous people. And it's just, it's hard to wrap your brain around people being so awful to other people. But it's our reality, and we're still dealing with this. In my junior year, I spent in South America. I was on an urban studies program in Colombia. We went to Panama, then we spent 3 or 4 months in Bogota in Colombia and traveled around Colombia to see different towns, and then went to Ecuador for a week and then a week in Peru. That was just a life-transforming, amazing experience. That was just a life-transforming, amazing experience with these 3 elite communists from Bogota. It was so funny because they were from the wealthiest families, and they were like having us read Marx and Lenin, and they were just a couple years older than we were. I mean, it was just amazing fun, and we learned so much. The urban studies program was an eye-opener for me in that I learned that I really like cities and figuring out how to make them thrive and how to make places worth visiting or worth staying or worth living in. And that's what really started my interest in how the arts can impact that and make a difference in the quality of life of different places. But it was really, really a good experience. And then the second semester I spent at the Lutheran Seminary in São Leopoldo, and I took a class on feminism in the Bible, another one about the history of the Lutheran Church in Brazil. And these professors were all people that my dad knew, and got to see them on a different level. And I made some friendships with some other German students that were there, and they were from Germany. I really liked it a lot. So then I went back to the U.S. and finished my senior year, and then I ended up in Chicago. I went with Lutheran Volunteer Corps to inner city Chicago and worked with 6 cluster churches that were in a 3-mile radius from each other. These churches all had been thriving in the 70s and emptied out with the white flight when minorities were moving in and white people were moving out, and that was kind of the bane of all these mainstream Protestant churches. They moved out to the suburbs, and their inner city churches started to deteriorate and didn't have the money to support them, and they started dying out. So we had come together as a group of 6 so that we could share resources, and I did youth group stuff and worked food pantry, clothing closet, all that kind of stuff. And then after that, I moved into the church that I was in the custodian apartment in this church for 20 years. When those 20 years ended, I had spent almost all of my life on church property until I moved to Paducah in 2005. Then for 2 years, I worked at Chicago Uptown Ministry, which was a Missouri Synod Lutheran assistance place on the north side. that neighborhood was a point of entry for a lot of immigrants. It was the most densely populated neighborhood in Chicago, and the public schools had over 40 languages spoken. It was another amazing experience on diversity, and there were so many things that I learned there. But I found that I didn't have the capacity to be around so much pain and misery. I did a lot of home visits and saw so many things that were so hurtful, the condition that people live in, that the poor live in. And it's very different from poverty in South America, or at least the kind that I saw, because there's what I saw in South America back then, there was dignity. And these German people in Brazil were very, very poor, the rural people that my dad visited. But over time, agriculture made them prosper. Their life circumstances really changed. Where here in the States, I feel like it's like a spiritual death, where people are just vacant and have no aspirations, nowhere to go. And after 2 years, I started crying all the time, and I couldn't do it anymore. But I continued to work in inner city things, but using art and creativity. And I found the passion of all my interests in those areas where art and economic development and sustainability meet. Those things I'm really passionate about. In 1988, I was hired by Uptown Center Whole House to manage a craft cooperative called Fourth World Artisans Co-op. I was there for 4 years, and we had the money from MacArthur Foundation to spin it off into a cooperative. And it was a great learning experience, and that's how I learned about the fair trade movement. And I had a lot of contact with immigrants from all over the world who had access to products that they were bringing in. And then there were the artist communities that we were part of. And I had a huge Brazilian group of friends that we had parties all the time, and we kept up with what was going on in Brazil. There were always new people coming, and it was just really, really fun and interesting and wild. Those were the great days in Chicago. And then after the co-op transitioned, I opened my own little store. Then I met Abdul Wardak, who has a shop here in Paducah as well, Beads and Rugs on Broadway. And we partnered in this huge space, 5,000 square feet. Our rent was $4,000 a month. And then 9/11 happened. Everybody boycotted everything from that region. The 20 years that I spent in Chicago were really wonderful in the sense that the multiculturalism, the art, the music, the experiences that we had. But I arrived there in 1984, and while I was working in social service, I could see the policies that Reagan passed and how they affected the poor. Then months, Chicago started looking like a third world country. There were homeless people everywhere. A lot of them were Vietnam vets. It just became worse and worse and worse. Gun violence. There were kids carrying Uzis around in my neighborhood. I was in the Latin Kings neighborhood. There were drugs that, I never felt scared because I didn't feel like I was the target. But one time I was at a pastor's house and a bullet came through the kitchen window, and we crouched down, and it was dangerous. I used to bike. The first 2 years that I was there, I biked everywhere, and I went to a women's meeting, and it was fall or winter, and the days were getting shorter. I sat down. All these women were just like, how can you be out there on a bike? In the city, it's dangerous, blah, blah, blah. And I sat down next to this old woman who said, don't you worry about them. Just keep your eyes open and be careful. She said, I got home one day and my mom had been chopped up into pieces and put in a bag, and I've never been scared since. I'll never forget that. She had the worst thing ever happen to her, and that made her strong. When you live in a place like that, you also become kind of closed down in some ways to what's happening around you. And I remember my sister coming to visit one time, and we were taking a train somewhere, and she was smiling at everybody. I never smiled at anybody. I just kept my eyes down and held on and tried to look tough. Everybody she made eye contact with smiled back. That's a lesson. That's, you can spread this joy, you can spread this innocence, you can touch people without saying a word. The churches that I was involved with in Chicago were all about the poor. And these pastors were trying to fix give assistance, give an ear, give whatever they could to the tremendous need that was everywhere. To me, that is where I see Christ, is in service, in helping. I moved to Paducah in 2005, and Chicago had become too expensive. It was all about who you knew now. It just really changed as a city. When I first moved there, I think I was making $18,000 a year plus health insurance, and then after I started doing the art stuff, I didn't have to make very much money to survive. But the last 5 years, everything had just gone through the roof, and all my friends were working all the time to try to pay their mortgages, and so we weren't seeing each other as much, and they were having kids and didn't really want to go out anymore. I'd been there, seen that, dealing with the traffic, and I just really longed to be in a smaller community. Paducah has been a very, very good place for me. We have an artist community here. It's an easy place to live. I ended up becoming a hermit here. For 13 years, I managed these properties for Abdul, my former partner in the gallery, and he bought 6 properties that were a slum landlord had owned, and they needed to be rehabbed. And in the beginning, I helped with demolition and the whole bit. And then I had joint problems and got older and fatter and couldn't do it anymore. But I dealt with the tenants and with anything that came up. I focused on selling online and on developing 2 online art communities, TAFA, the Textile and Fiber Art List, and Artisan Made. These online friendships were so wonderful because they were people from all over the world. It was just really interesting to see what other people were doing. I could travel vicariously and just be here and pretend like I had access to other places. I didn't invest in anything locally. I wasn't very social. There are a lot of really wonderful people here that I've never made an effort to get to know. Trump was elected, and I really fell off of my seat. I couldn't believe that this man was going to represent the United States. Worse, that the churches, the evangelical churches, supported him. For the 4 years that he was president, I felt like I was punched in the gut every single day from one abhorrent thing to another. Just horrible things that I think are really bad for our country, bad for people, bad for animals, bad for nature. It just shocked me. And then I realized that basically he was elected because there are so many people like me that have withdrawn from society, are spending all their time online. So I started thinking about, what can I do for Paducah? How can I make a little impact here? I had all these different variations of ideas and I realized that bringing the international stuff is really something that I have connections to and I can contribute with. Also, that there are a lot of immigrants that live here. There's really not much attention given to that or to their stories. So I started thinking about how to do that, and then my friend Diane offered to be a silent partner, and we bought this house. Her money, my time. The upstairs is an Airbnb with an international theme. One room is Africa, one room is Asia, and the other room is the Americas. And then COVID hit, stopped everything. And I did not handle COVID well at all. And my server destroyed my websites. Everything just was like falling apart. Last year, 2020, I basically knit and didn't do anything, just thought. I read a lot about art and community development and tried to think of ideas of what I want to do. And the big thing for me is that Brazil now has Bolsonaro there. Bolsonaro was a young man in the military when we were under Brazil's dictatorship. He knows that world and would like to see Brazil go back to that. That's his solution to resolving issues of violence and injustice and chaos. He has said that he would shoot his son if he found out he was a homosexual. He says that indigenous people either need to assimilate or die. He's fine with destroying the Amazon because there's gold under there. The man is just a small-minded bigot who will destroy the country. And he is a Trump supporter, a vaccine denier, and people are dying. We've lost 600,000 people in the United States, which is more than all of the wars our veterans fought in the last century. Yet people, it's like they don't care. It doesn't seem to matter. And the whole thing of the vaccines and everything becoming political, and that the churches support this stuff. And the same thing is happening in Brazil. The evangelical churches there are also supporting Bolsonaro, and they're also putting distrust in science. These two ideas of what Christianity should be about are so far removed from what I was taught and what I grew up with. I don't understand this Christian body that is taking over. I feel like the church is at fault for the misery that's going on in this world. So what do we do? How do I handle that? How do I process my experience in the church, my understanding of what God means and what Christ means? How do I apply that? I took a class in college on peace and violence. That class had a religion professor and a philosophy professor together. We looked at how these things happen, both peace and violence, from a microcosmic view to a macro view. You start out with yourself. How do you achieve peace within yourself? Where's the violence that happens inside yourself? I think it was Confucius that said, the only thing you can control really is how you handle what's around you. You can only handle your reaction. You're only responsible for what you can do. I know that I need to learn how to love more and how to be kinder and be more available and all those things. The other thing about doing something for the community, if everybody tried to do one thing that impacts, volunteer somewhere, do something, help somebody. My mom is 85 and she's driving all these people around. They don't have public transportation there. Their kids are working all the time. They don't have anybody. It's just awful what's going on in rural America. So she drives them to their medical appointments. She's a hospice volunteer. She's involved in her church. So get out there and do something. Do something good. If all of us contribute in some way, maybe we can make an impact on all the negativity that's happening. For all of the crazies that are out there, all the bad people, and I always felt this in Chicago, there are so many more who are good and who are minding their own business and doing the right thing. People know what's right and what's wrong. We can move things in a better direction. And another thing that really bothers me is that both Brazilians and Americans have this insane phobia against, quote, communism or anything that can help poor people in this country. It's socialism. Well, it's not. There are many ways of structuring things. Just because wealth is distributed in ways that can hopefully address some of these horrible issues that we have going on in our country doesn't mean that you become a socialist country. Public schools, our libraries, we have lots and lots of institutions that have been there for the people, that have helped bring people into a larger society and become responsible citizens. A lot of these things are crumbling. Our infrastructure is crumbling, and there are so many things that can benefit everybody. My mom has very poor Wi-Fi reception where she's at. Wouldn't it be great if all rural people had access to broadband? Why can't we have solar panels here in Kentucky? My sister's in New Jersey, and they have enabled their residents to buy solar panels and sell back into the grid. Why can't that happen for everybody? Why can't we do things that benefit the environment? If we don't fix what's going on with the climate, it's over for all of us. The big reason why conservative evangelicals are supporting people like Bolsonaro and Trump is because they are anti-abortion, they're homophobic, or there are many other issues that they don't agree with. If we look at Christ and look at love, then we don't have to agree with what people do, but we can love them. We try to figure out how we can work together. I am firmly committed to the notion that church and state must be separate. When we talk about the state and about politics or laws, these are things that should happen for everybody, that should protect everybody, no matter what. But we're looking at trying to move this country into becoming a totalitarian state by telling teachers that they can't teach history. It's really frightening. We all have to learn how to live in the gray areas and to embrace them. We can have questions without answers. These are really, really tough times that we're living in, and I just hope that we can find a way to make changes that will give hope to our next generations. That's my story, and I'm going to be 60 next year. I feel really bad about how my generation is leaving this little world, what we're doing to it. A lot of us were hippies way back when and idealists, and now look at where we are. I also believe in the young people, and I want to give them my support if I can and help them in problem solving and trying to do things that are possible, that have results. So I'm hopeful, and I want to move forward in that. My dad died a few years back, and we all miss him so much. One of the things that was really good was that his sister Marion kept all the letters that my parents sent all those years that we were in Brazil. I was able to transcribe about 2/3 of them to a blog. And if this history stuff about Brazil interests you, it's really fascinating to read my mom and my dad writing back about what's going on. My dad was an amateur photographer, and he took lots and lots of photos of us when we were kids. And so it was really interesting to me to hear their stories about the photos that we were so familiar with and being able to pair them up that way. You can go to Beals in Brazil with a Z.blogspot.com. It needs more organizing, but there's a lot there to look at. A couple of the stories from there is that Mom heard about JFK's death because a boy came to the door and told her that her president had been killed. There's another thing that she says in one of her letters. When I was 5 or 6, she's complaining to my aunt that Rachel knows how to push all my buttons. And things like that. But they also describe the church and their activities, and I think it's a really interesting document for people who are curious about that time period and that special place in Brazil when all this development was going on and all these big changes were happening. My personal website, where I have a lot of the ideas of things that I would like to do in Paducah or just in general, is Loyola.com.